So when we think about kind of the formation of a new country, right? Certainly our country comes to birth in 1776. We have the Constitutional Congress, 1787. So not very long after that. Think about this. In 1790, 2-3 years after we formulate and formalize a Constitution of the United States, one of the very first acts that becomes passed is the naturalization law, right? So who can become a naturalized citizen in the United States? So already we have what many scholars would call a race-based law of citizenship and exclusion. In that, right, the Naturalization Act restricts citizenship to, quote, any alien being a free white person who had been in the United States. So in effect, it really limits, right, citizenship participation for the majority of those who were living at that time. Of course, there are ways that we can define and redefine citizenship, but this is also a way that it's been excluded from the get-go. And when we think about these notions of citizenship, who should be educated, who shouldn't be educated, how do we begin to educate for a democracy, right? And even from the very outset, as much as the principles of democracy has been set in place, right, for the right to and the pursuit of happiness and equality and justice under the law, there are ways that it's been thought of and interpreted in very different ways. Now, the image that you have before you now, and some of you might already know, right, and some would really represent that towards manifest destiny. And this idea of manifest destiny, that the country was ordained by God to bring civilization and progress westward, right? So you have the angelic figure. She is moving west, bringing civilization, bringing progress with her. So you'll already note in this pictograph of John Gast entitled American Progress, you have that light of civilization coming from the east because it's already been settled, civilized, right? And towards the west, you have that darkness, and that darkness being represented by American Indians, by indigenous populations who have yet to receive the light of progress and civilization. Of course, this becomes also a highly problematic symbol of what other historians would call this kind of tradition of settler colonialism in the United States. And it's how do we think about progress, right? Because it has a double-edged sword with it. And so she's bringing about also railroads, that telegraph wire that she's also holding. And interestingly enough, right, what she has so closely clutched to her chest that automatically we would assume, well, manifest destiny, it's got to be the Holy Bible, right? Well, it's not. Right? And this was kind of a surprise to me when I first found this out, because all these years we're all assuming that it's the Holy Bible, that she's also bringing westward towards civilization. But what she's carrying is the Book of the Common School, right? And I want us to really think about that too. Think about the implication of that, what progress means as we bring it from lightness to darkness through that representation of the Common School book. And I bring that also, this visual, to light to really think about and to encapsulate the context of the time period in which all these different elements of change is happening. And another way for us to think about this notion of progress, this notion of democratic citizenship in the schools, I really like to start many of my courses with this opening passage from James Anderson's Education of Blacks in the South, because it's really about how have our nation's leaders, how have our school reformers and leaders really, how do they think about citizenship, but how do they think about education for democratic citizenship and education for second-class citizenship? Because while these may seem like contradictory terms, how do they coexist, right? How do they work in a way that were, as he notes, occupied by the same leaders and occupied in these ideological senses to keep particular groups deliberately subjugated, And of course, that's not something that you might like to hear, but because we do have that historical evidence of how it became enforced through laws, but also in our educational policies and practices. How do we think about that in the context of our current debates about the achievement gap? When we have a tradition that already set in place that some group of kids would get that better education and other groups would get that industrial type of education, the kind of education for servitude. But at the same time, we have to remember that as long as there have been oppressed groups, not just in our country, but elsewhere around the world, we have to remember the place of agency. And agency being that they use those elements, the right to equal protection under the law. Of course, that doesn't become formalized until after the Civil War, but that ideal of equality under the law has been fought in our nation's court systems, especially if we were to think about school segregation issues. We have ample evidence, and just the slide just has a few, right? Of course, as I note. But wait, there's plenty more. But these are some of the court cases that just kind of came off the top of my mind as I was thinking about some of the major court cases. And you'll note that it's not just one particular minority group, but it's a vast array, right? That when we think about minority groups in the United States, and so we think about from the earliest beginnings, right? From Sarah Roberts in the Boston case in 1850. And Boston. We think about Boston as kind of that bastion of democracy if we think about kind of the history of the United States. But yet, even in the North, there have been these early fights for school desegregation, but not just in the northeastern parts of the United States, but along the West Coast, the Southwest, the Midwest, right, as we keep thinking about it. So there are ways that we really need to step back and think of, okay, we realize that there are these oppressive systems that's been in place. It's not as if it's going to go away, but yet we can't forget how often there were advocates, parents, community leaders, religious leaders, politicians, who were advocating for the fight that if we're going to provide public schooling and education for all of those who live in our midst, we need to ensure that these processes also occur.